Welcome to our global audience for today's session on automation and machine learning AI, in particular their application to security. I'm Dave Frampton, Sumo Logic's General Manager for Cloud SIM and Security Analytics, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by Vijaya Kaza from Airbnb. Two roles for Vijaya at Airbnb: first, Chief Security Officer, and second, Head of Engineering and Data Science for Trust and Safety. Vijaya, welcome to our annual user conference, Illuminate.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for having me here.
It's great to be here with you live, by the way. I should just say we're live here in the studio.
I know, it's
we're
so great to be doing live.
It's good to see you again.
Almost feels real.
Exactly. So let's dive in and tackle automation first. I think many in our audience that spans kind of practitioner all the way through CISO and everything in between understands at some intuitive level that automation is the only way to keep up with the explosion in the amount of data and the new threat surfaces and the like from cloud, digital transformation. So maybe against that breadth of audience, just maybe give us an overall sense of prioritization and where to start from your perspective.
Yeah, great question, Dave. I'm sure most people in your audience and most organizations are in the middle of some sort of automation projects already, especially those that are very straightforward benefits like detection, workflow automation around investigation, or remediation using one of the several orchestration products that are out there that offer automated response. Those are all great, obviously, but being on the CISO side as well as on the vendor side of the table, from my own practical experience, I can tell you that outside of all of the hype and excitement around these solutions, getting the basics right and getting the basics at scale is really top of my list when it comes to automation in this urgent and important matrix that we think about, certainly top of my list, right? So when I talk about basics, what I mean is referring to things like vulnerability management, patch management, basic security hygiene. That is not necessarily very exciting, the most exciting thing, but it is so important, right? Because every day we come across so many vulnerabilities that are out there, and oftentimes we are at the receiving end of it to say, hey, we have to patch all of our systems within a matter of hours. And that would not be possible without having some level of automation already in place, right? So the other thing I would say is when it comes to basics like that, more is certainly better. When you can go back to the example I was talking about and patching, why stop at automation of patching and stopping right there, but go the extra mile of also automating the verification post-patch to ensure the patch actually works as expected after rescanning, right? So these sorts of things, I think they can pay huge dividends considering how often we use these, right? Beyond those kind of basics, I would say there are a couple of other use cases that are very important for me as well. One is automation as a way to ensure quality, consistency, and avoiding human errors. For example, you take automated templates or hardened configuration to spin up new environments. These are the guardrails that would be very, very helpful for your teams so that they avoid accidental mistakes while doing these sorts of things. I would say one other use case that's not obvious at first, enhancing user experience as a way to improve security posture. I mean, at first you may be like, what has user experience got to do with security posture? But I can tell you this example where, every practitioner understands this. Getting the access controls based on least privilege right in an organization for your users is very, very hard problem. Right? So if you have so much friction and manual steps involved in getting some of those exceptions approved, there's obviously going to be a tendency to say, hey, let me just over-provision this, why bother, right? And then, obviously it's going to be a huge problem. So automating those types of workflows and getting it, so that user experience is really driving good behavior so that people are much more inclined to do the right thing from the get-go.
That's great. It's something new, I think, for folks in the audience, basics at scale, and it's not necessarily going faster, but more accurate, and then being very pragmatic and thoughtful about removing friction from processes that are critical to compliance. That's fantastic. On the flip side of it, as people go down this journey, What are some of the challenges that they might face when trying to automate all of these processes that you've talked about?
Yeah, so barriers to automation that often come about are, the 3 T's, right? Talent, time, and technology, right? So those are all super important to get right in order to have successful automation projects. But I think there are 2 other factors, culture and also processes, that are equally important, if not more important. Automation, if you think about it, really works well when you have the underlying workflow or process nailed really well, and then you're just using automation to codify some of those practices so that you are becoming more efficient now, right? But automation isn't going to be solving or masking if you have underlying cultural issues or problems to begin with. For example, if you have an organizational culture such that the development teams don't patch on a regular basis, going back to the example of basic hygiene, but there is no point then to automate all of the ticket creation and tracking and get super fancy on those things.
Right.
What's the point? It's not going to do you any good. So getting that cultural elements right and making sure the organization is well aligned with the priorities and how do you actually get into that so that automation can then be used to advance and accelerate is a much better way to do it. From a processes standpoint, often there's a tendency to always prioritize what's most urgent today, the fire of today, over any strategic things like getting automation prioritized, right? The teams are small and always fighting for resources. So I think, you have to plan and prioritize explicitly for some things like this. Maybe even on top of some of the, taking the hit on some of the operational issues at times. Otherwise, you'll never move the needle. You won't change the status quo.
That's good. Make the tough trade-offs there and build on a solid foundation. Just last one on automation. Is there any aspect of automation that our audience may not be as familiar with that kind of has your eye on the horizon that's emerging that you'd like to share?
Yeah, definitely. With the advances in cloud and digital transformation, it's becoming increasingly easier to automate because most of the applications have standardized data formats and APIs, and it's really easier to do end-to-end automation these days. But that said, there may be many situations where end-to-end automation still can feel like a monumental task and somewhat unrealistic for some organizations, right? So the alternate approach of maybe taking a more reasonable approach into keeping the human intervention, but automating certain parts of the flow, not entirely end-to-end, especially if you have some legacy applications that don't lend themselves very well for automation. They don't have the APIs and what have you. It could be a good approach as well. So robotic process automation, RPA, could be a really good way to do that, right? So RPA, think of that as a bot that is programmed to automate specific repetitive tasks and parts of your workflow and can mimic human interaction at places and coexist with other human intervention. So let's take an example of maybe a bot that is programmed to give out errors when something is misconfigured, or warn the users that, hey, you have an operating system that is running out of date. You're running an out-of-date operating system and you have to upgrade, things of that nature, right? So anywhere where you can actually have specific rules, workflow-based, predictable outcomes, you can automate those using RPA so that when those rules are met, you can get benefit from the automation.
Benefit. It's almost like instead of trying to design the human out of the loop, you're accepting the workflow with the human in the loop, just speeding up the workflow as it is. Instead. I mean, it almost sounds like if I hear you right, that you think there's maybe a role for the next couple of cycles of whether product or technology on the way to this vision of full automation where there'll be a lot of room for innovation and how to accelerate the interaction between humans and machines. Am I stretching too far there?
No, I think you're absolutely right, because I think in reality, we're probably several years away from taking the human out of the loop completely, right? So there is this period where, as a community between practitioners and the people that are providing the technology, if you can collaborate well together and innovate in ways where human interaction can exist, but over a period of time, that gets reduced more and more, and the machine intelligence and automation can continue to increase.
Comes on.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a great transition at this point over to machine learning and AI, because it sort of shares this similar characteristic of, it's not all the way to the nirvana of put up your feet and let the machine figure it out for you.
Yeah.
And so then the question is, how do we go along the way? Against all of this vision casting and hype around ML and AI to this point, what do you find is actually working today? Like, what are practical use cases that practitioners are using, making a real difference for the defense today in machine learning and AI?
Yeah. AI is actually being used quite extensively in security today, primarily in the form of machine learning through supervised learning mode, right? So this is the type of machine learning mode where you are taking your machine learning models and training them with high quality data and labels prior to deploying them, right? So this type of machine learning can be very helpful in use cases like straightforward threat detection, anomaly detection. You can have asset discovery, posture assessment, or doing things at a large scale where you are looking for specific data elements in a large sea of data warehouse, looking for PIA as an example. So those could be very straightforward use cases for supervised machine learning. There's also unsupervised machine learning that is in use today. This is the kind where you don't train ahead of time, but the machine learning model can be sophisticated enough and self-learning, so that it can detect patterns by grouping similar data points within the data set, right? So this can be very effective, let's say, clustering algorithms that are used to detect bots, because they can differentiate based on the user behavior, which behavior looks like bots versus what behavior looks like humans. And then finally, there are a couple of other types of AI that are also in use. Computer vision or machine vision can be used to detect fake websites and phishing websites. That could be pretty effective there. And last but not least, natural language processing. I think it can be very effective when it comes to email security products, or anywhere you're basically scanning communication channels, messaging to identify scams, spams, or phishing.
Right, fantastic. And against those use cases which are getting traction, maybe the last couple emerging, but getting traction, it seems somewhat ironic that the whole of machine learning and AI was designed to scale data analytics, and yet these first iterations of them, even though they are having practical effect, scaling in implementation of the technology is sometimes more challenging, particularly in light of cloud migration, digital transformation of businesses, which sort of create all of this new surface area of data to analyze and then react to. What have you found as you've gone on your journey here are some challenges in scaling ML and AI for the use cases that you've outlined here?
Yeah, great question, Dave. I think scaling machine learning is a completely different challenge. When you think about machine learning, the technology behind machine learning itself, whether you call it libraries, frameworks like TensorFlow, PyTorch, there are plenty of those out there, and that in itself is not the complication there. But getting these implemented at scale such that for whatever use case you are picking, the false positives and false negatives are minimized. You are able to get your decisions. You're able to maintain and tune the machine learning models so that you can optimize for the right precision and recall over a long period of time as your data is changing and new data is emerging, right? So that becomes very, very challenging. So as we talked about, since most of the machine learning models today are supervised learning primarily, the first thing you would need is large amounts of data sets and ground truth, right? So data is the first place the challenge starts, both in terms of the quantity of data as well as the quality of the data, right? So quantity of data in most organizations, depending on the type of and size of the organization, you may or may not have access to this kind of vast amount of data set that you can actually effectively train on. And then even if you have that kind of data, the quality of the data is a huge problem, right? Oftentimes you have inconsistent data, multiple duplicative data sources, not having a single source of truth. And then from there, people are not paying attention to data quality bugs and the data quality deteriorates over a period of time. So that becomes a really huge issue. So that's just one aspect, one dimension of the overall complication here. So proceeding further, if you think about the next step of ML infrastructure, and if you're applying ML for fraud or security use cases, most of those need real-time detection, which means high performance, low latency, and combined with large set of data, right? So you need huge amounts of compute and infrastructure and storage to actually deal with this, right? So that could be prohibitively expensive for some organizations and may not be the easiest thing to set up. And then, I could also, talk about a couple more points here. One is about ML practice, right? So if you think about the overall ML at scale, the ML algorithms and coding is a small aspect of the entire equation. There's so many complications around it, right? Thinking about feature engineering, how do you do the right level of feature engineering so you either don't overfit or underfit, and then experimentation, inference, model analysis, observability, the list goes on, right? And then last but not least, I would say the considerations of security, privacy, ethics, and bias is a huge deal these days. So most problems exist on the bias side because there is not enough diverse data set in the training set. But if you go on to find that diverse data set, how do you acquire that data while maintaining and balancing the needs of security and privacy? So it becomes a huge challenge overall.
A huge challenge. I mean, you took us high with the beginning, which was, hey, there are practical use cases. We're making a lot of progress. You went through 6, 8 of them, which is great. Brought us back to earth with the the listed challenges. I know some of these would be topics for talks in and of themselves, like data quality and quantity and all of that. But maybe just, if you could just give some high-level advice to people who are tackling those challenges, just some best practices, just to kind of build us back up on it, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. I think getting access to data at huge number of users or clients, right? That would be a starting point. And if you see a threat in one client environment, for example, understanding the prevalence of it and seeing that in other clients and correlating there could be a huge benefit. So needless to say, I mean, access to a large number of users and clients, but also treating data as a first-class citizen within an organization and having that culture of, most organizations treat software sacred, right? They have all these practices about, specs and reviews and all of that. But when it comes to data, they don't do most of it. But I think equally important to do all of that for data, and having a strong data science practice, data engineering practice, and investing in the right underlying infrastructure and architecture are really all important things.
All important. As you tick through some of these, and I know there are more, we're just trying to get to some other questions, but it strikes me that there's a maturity curve on the part of an enterprise. Where on that maturity curve does an enterprise need to be before they have the resources, the expertise, the patience to tackle this on their own, versus trying to either outsource part of it, all of it, use commercial offers, piece that together, and advice for the audience, just given that we have both camps represented, I think.
Yeah, no, you're very right. So large organizations obviously have access to all of the things that I talked about, but for many smaller organizations, it becomes impossible to get started because of all of these challenges. So, but thankfully there are many vendors that are offering out-of-the-box solutions for almost every stage of the life cycle that I talked about, starting from the data warehouse to the entire ML life cycle management. But of course, there are obviously custom-built solutions in the areas of SIM and analytics, that security analytics, that use a lot of ML and AI natively as well, as you very well know. So leveraging some of those things can give a leg up for sure when you start ML projects.
You start, okay, that's fantastic. Where from here? Like if you now, that's sort of the current, and went through the challenges, some approaches, practical use cases, but as you look forward, arc out a couple of generations of the technology and give us a sense of where you think it's going.
Yeah, this is frankly the most exciting part of the conversation for me. So most of the talk in AI today is around, how do we get to the point of simulating human behavior and human reasoning, right? There's certainly a day out there where synthetics and conscious AI is going to take over the world, and that's certainly the future someday, maybe during our lifetimes. But even before we get there, there's quite a bit we can do in security with even far less ambitious AI, right? So when we talked about the supervised and unsupervised learning and self-learning modes, the more you can go towards the unsupervised learning, it doesn't require a lot of training and could be self-learning and doesn't require a lot of this data manipulation and training data set, the more you can use for security use cases, right? So imagine, a future where you have the AI brain sitting in the center of your security operations, if you will, watching all of your environment, the data, the flows, users, assets, and really understanding the big picture of what's happening and learning it on its own. And if something changes, for example, and that AI brain could immediately give you the recommendations proactively to say, here's how you can do this, so you can proactively manage the risk, right? And even more, because it understands all of the users and the environment very well, it can give very tailored recommendations based on specific users and their behaviors, and very, very customized for the organization. So all that leads up to, I think, one of the very exciting possibilities that we haven't actually spent quite a bit of time till today, frankly, in the vendor space, which is simulation of the environments. So because AI is watching and learning the environment, you can get to a point where adaptively it can generate all of the simulations to test the efficacy of your security controls,
right, rather
rather than having this point-in-time red team activities that you do maybe once in 6 months and once a year, but constantly simulating the breaches, right? And if there is a real breach, for that matter, it could get into the mode of throwing some deception technologies or deterring the bad guys in some fashion.
Even scenario planning, right?
Scenario
you can
planning.
Simulate scenarios either for a breach or even
Completely.
changes in the attack
Right.
surface or the defense.
And then I think it's not too far from today, I don't think, where we could use natural language processing and voice activation in the security operations center, SOCs, and to do threat hunting using a very natural way of asking questions and getting responses versus all these query languages that you have to
Right.
put together, right? So it could be very exciting.
Yeah, no, that's definitely an exciting future. And with an eye towards the breadth of the audience, I think I mentioned before we came on set here that we have a large number of practitioners as
Yep.
well as engineers, architects, and CISOs. Bring us back now to the here and now, just practical advice that you would have for practitioners, maybe as our last question today.
Yeah, I know we talked about some hype and some future and some practice today, but anytime somebody starts on ML project or automation of any sort, for that matter, really taking a step back and understanding what problems am I solving, right? And is the automation or ML or AI the right solution for that problem? And starting with that mindset, asking the why is super important, right? And thinking from the perspective of maybe the metrics that we are trying to move could be a good way of answering that question. Am I trying to reduce my ticket closing time or detection time or some other thing that I'm trying to do within my SOC? Those could lead to the right answers and show you the path to the right level of investment so you get the best ROI. And then just start small, and as we talked about before, mix and match with some human intervention and some automation could be a great place to start.
Yeah, fantastic. Vijaya, thank you so much for joining us here live in the studio, more importantly for sharing your thought leadership with the community. As you mentioned, you have deep background on both the CISO side, but then also on the technology development side. And I think it gave our audience just a great survey of some topics, both automation and ML AI, that are really going to be the centerpiece of how the defense orients and pivots in the next couple of years. Thank you again so much.
My pleasure, Dave. It was great chatting.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.